thank you so much, Eleanor Nesbitt, for joining us on the faculty of the Summer School 2019. I think it's the first time you've been on a summer school faculty, and I'd be very grateful if you would introduce yourself to our students.
Okay, so my name's Eleanor Nesbitt. I'm what they call a Professor Emeritus. That means that I'm still attached to the University of Warwick and its Centre for Educational Studies, but I'm no longer a salaried member of staff. And my main work over the years has been ethnographic. It's been field work, mainly amongst Hindu and Sikh and various sorts of Christian communities.
And you yourself, what is your religious affiliation?
Well, I'm a member of the Religious Society of Friends, which usually has Quakers in brackets after it. So people are generally known as Quakers, and the Quakers owe their origins to the insights of George Fox in the 17th century, an Englishman who was discontented with the religious activity available in his time and believed in having a direct connection with God and emphasizing values like truth and dispensing with priesthood and church buildings and so forth.
And you're known as the Society of Friends. I wondered whether you would explain what was meant by friends or friendship in the context of this.
Oh, it's an interesting one. It began in England, in fact in the Midlands of England, in the middle of the 17th century, which was a time of considerable turbulence. And George Fox's insights were very much that we didn't need priests and church buildings and so on, but it was possible to have a direct experience of God. And Quakers were referred to at first and called themselves Friends of Truth, Friends of God, Friends of Christ. That's where the Friends comes in. And Quaker was a nickname which has two explanations, one being that Quakers, and they will still say this, often feel a sort of tremor as they feel moved to speak in the largely silent meeting for worship, but also George Fox is reputed to have told the judge in Derby in the court that he should tremble at the name of the Lord. So interchangeably we're friends and we're Quakers, and of course having friend in our title makes us think about friendship. We make little jokes about, oh, that wasn't very friendly, and we talk about friends with a capital F and friends with a lowercase f sometimes, to make the distinction between friendship in general and membership of the society in particular.
And are there any particular practices of friendship that exemplify the circle of friends that the Quakers see themselves as being?
Well, I think the fact that we tend to sit in a circle or to sit very much at the same level in an informal way, and that our meetings for worship try to be as inclusive as possible, and we have within each local meeting what we call overseers, who are people concerned with the pastoral care of the meeting. And we try to be good citizens in the sense of, particularly in a place like Coventry where I am, showing friendship to asylum seekers, refugees, people who are in obvious need.
So friendship to each other through care and friendship extending outwards.
Yes, but I think that's no different from just about every other religious community I've come across.
Thank you. Well, now I think it's time for us to move into our area of study today. And perhaps in order to explain to the students, you'd explain what your initial contacts were with the Sikhs, how you came to be connected or an expert on the Sikh practices.
Well, it seems a long time ago now. I was, first of all, a student of theology and religious studies in the University of Cambridge, and there was no Indian religion in what I was studying. But my first teaching job was in the north of India, not in Punjab, the Sikh homeland, but in an area where there were boarding schools, and in the school where I was teaching, about half my students were Sikh, and naturally I wanted to know more about them. And when I came back to England, I was appointed to a post in Coventry in the Midlands between London and Birmingham, where there was a sizable Sikh population. A lot of my students for extra English were again Sikhs, and so I thought I must go to university and study about Sikhism. So I was very, very lucky that this desire matched a re-advertisement for a post in the University of Nottingham to make a study of local Sikhs. And that's really where my involvement began. And because Sikhs are hospitable and gracious and welcoming to outsiders, it was a delight to be carrying out field work in Sikh congregations, in gurdwaras, places of worship, and I was frequently invited to homes. And so I had that sort of social grounding. But I have to say, while I was in India, before I came back to teaching in England, I had visited several historic Sikh shrines. And it was particularly interesting for me because I was actually accompanied by a Hindu colleague. So I had a perspective which was not just my own perspective as this English woman who was learning, but I was also seeing things through the eyes of Punjabis, people of the same ethnic background as Sikhs, but with a slightly different angle, as well as hearing from Sikhs themselves. So I was having a triple perspective really from the start.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to put that on the record because you are the only one of our scholars for the summer school who's not speaking about the religion in which they themselves are a practitioner. But,
yes.
Isn't Eleanor Sikh by marriage?
No, my husband is a Hindu.
Hindu by marriage, but isn't Sikh and Hindu really the same thing with the distinctions being secondary and later? So you sort of qualify.
Well, you see, from a Hindu point of view, that might just about be an acceptable statement. From most Sikhs' point of view, that would be totally unacceptable. It would be like saying Christians are Jews.
Today, not today, but not 50 years ago. 50 years ago it would have flown.
Yes, you see, things change, and particularly since 1984 and the sort of polarization between many Sikhs and the Indian government, which they perceived as Hindu, and so on, there has been a distancing. And Sikhs growing up in another country like Britain have not had the experience that many Sikhs in India have had of going to Hindu shrines, of basically seeing themselves as the same community. So certainly youngsters growing up in a place like Britain and going to religious education classes and so on grow up with a sense of Sikhism as a very separate religion. And I would say actually that the history of the Sikhs is one of constant defining of themselves over against what is around them, which tends to be Muslim and Hindu populations. So although there is a friendliness, there is also a sort of protectiveness and care, because Sikhs are always in a minority. Even in the state of Punjab in India, they're just teetering over, well, they're just about a majority there, but there's no country where they're a majority. So there is a sense of needing to establish themselves very consciously as a distinct world religion. There's a fear of being somehow subsumed. So yes, so my husband as a Hindu and as a Brahmin has his own perspective on Sikhs, which is often one of a very slight amusement, which I find, and Sikhs would find, quite condescending, because it is this idea that, well, they're just part of us.
Mm-hmm. So let's move on then to the concepts of friendship in the Sikh religion. You have written for us in our Elijah publication, and you speak about the importance and the significance of friendship. I wonder whether you'd share with the students the centrality or the importance, significance of friendship, and the different types of friendship that you've identified within the Sikh religion.
Well, friendship is absolutely central. So God is addressed as a friend, as well as the relationship between God and the human being, that of lover and beloved, or teacher and disciple. But friendship is one of the models for the human relationship with the divine. Then there's the friendship between people who are together in the congregation, in the Sangat. Definitely the sense of solidarity and friendship of those who have a sense of being gurmukh, of being oriented towards the Guru, towards truth, for whom religion is an important part of their lives. But Sikhs, culturally, they're part of Punjabi tradition, Indian tradition, which is hugely hospitable anyway. So there's friendship like that. The there are many sorts of friendship. I suppose one of the restrictions, at least in the past, has been friendship between men and women, boys and girls over a certain age, because of the implications for izzat, family honour, and so on, and any gossip that got around would be dangerous. So there have been restrictions on friendship in that sense. But the idea of the Gurdwara is a place where people sit in friendship, admittedly men together and women together, and also in the langar, where they sit on the same level to receive food and they serve food, and there is this stress on equality, and that has to be very close to ideas of friendship.
Could you just speak a little more about the langar as a practice of friendship? I don't know that our students are familiar with it at all.
Well, langar, Langar, interestingly, the origins of the word are, it's a word that means anchor, as in the anchor of a ship. And it's certainly something which is central and which holds the community together. It's not just an incidental addition of a canteen or a kitchen or something like that. Every day, certainly in larger gurdwaras, in most gurdwaras, every day there is free vegetarian hospitality available for everybody who comes. And anybody, whatever their social standing, can work in the kitchen and serve food and so on. So the whole institution stresses equality, and that has to be understood in the context of a society which traditionally has been very hierarchical, and certainly the very rich and the very poor, or the very high caste and the very low caste, wouldn't eat together. I think it's only fair to say that the idea of langar preceded the Sikh gurus. There were Sufis, there were Muslim saints who had a langar, but I don't think it was so formalized as an everyday institution on the scale that it is now with Sikhs. And an interesting thing that's happening is that as we, in countries like Britain, live with increasing homelessness and obvious destitution on our streets, Sikhs have become aware that their langar needs to go out into the streets and not just be an institution that welcomes those who venture into the Gurdwara. So you see vans outside a Gurdwara with names like Seva Aid or Khalsa Aid, Sikhs going out into city centres, providing vegetarian food, snacks for people, and also in the case of somebody, for example, called Ravi, set up Khalsa Aid, taking langar, taking this hospitality to war zones, to areas of desperate need. And just this last Sunday, I heard him speaking about taking this sort of Sikh practice into the heart of the Yazidis, who have suffered a lot in Central Asia, in the Middle East. So at the moment, the langar is emerging from the Gurdwara in a way that it didn't, say, 30 or 40 years ago. And the idea of langar is inspiring a Sikh response to current social needs.
So in fact, what you're describing and what I'm hearing is this is an act of tremendous generosity and kindness, you know, wonderful adjectives that we would use, or nouns that we would use to describe it. But is it friendship? In what way is it friendship?
Yes, this is such a good question, because it depends how narrowly you define friendship. I mean, clearly, for some people, the first encounter they have with Sikhs is through the langar and the welcome. And that can very well lead to friendship, to making contact with individuals and feeling included and developing friendship, exchange of ideas and so forth. So I think langar is definitely an element in friendship, but it's not a synonym for friendship.
And are there other acts acts of friendship that you see evident in Sikh communities?
Well, I think the whole emphasis on seva is voluntary service. Langar is one form of it, but the emphasis on serving the community, serving other individuals, again, it connects very strongly with friendship, and it's partly inspired by examples from the past. For example, Bahai Kanaya, who was rebuked on the battlefield because he was giving water to the wounded of whatever side. But the Guru affirmed what he was doing, basically saying, when you give water and comfort to those who have fallen, you're giving it to me. So that sort of message resonates through the centuries. And as I say, the Punjabi tradition, quite apart from whether people are Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, that Punjabi tradition is a very hospitable tradition. But I think there's also a danger of overemphasizing friendship, because as soon as people are close or in some sort of relationship of respect and affection, in Sikh tradition and in, for example, Hindu tradition, you would immediately start addressing people as brother or sister, uncle or aunt, son or daughter, because actually what in the West might be called friendship is expressed most clearly through terms of family relationship. And so really the family is the sort of model. And if you were to say, well, he's my friend, that would actually be distancing someone in a traditional Sikh context. Because if anyone was your friend, you'd immediately say, this is my brother, or this is my sister.
Yes. So maybe we need to draw out the values associated with friendship in the Sikh tradition, because we've talked a little bit about generosity and hospitality, but what other values do you associate with friendship in the Sikh tradition?
I think there has to be trust, and there has to be respect. There has to be compassion, and compassion is very much a value that Sikhs have respected, and again is endorsed by the Sikh Gurus in their scripture, for example, which is the Guru Granth Sahib. The word is Daya, D-A-Y-A, for compassion. You could say, well, that's not friendship, but it's an element in certain sorts of friendly relationships.
In your introduction about Sikhism, you spoke about God as friend and the model of God as friend. When you talk about God as friend, what does that mean? Are they the same values on the human level or different?
I think there are many ways of answering that. An opening statement in the Guru Granth Sahib is one about the one, often translated as God, the ultimate being, whatever, who is without hate and without fear. And actually, being without hate and being without fear seems pretty close to an idea of friendship to me, and certainly a good model for building relationships with other people. So I think I would emphasize that, the divine attribute, the divine quality of not harboring hatred and not being liable to fear of others.
Can I query that, Eleanor? We tend to think of friendship as something reciprocal,
Yes.
as distinct from, say, the relationship with the guru, which is more hierarchical. What is the reciprocity in the relationship with God as friend, or is it purely a metaphor that is designed to convey certain ideas, such as you just described? And for that matter, does friendship as such assume equality and parity, or can friendship be maintained even in situations of different hierarchical standing?
It's a good question, isn't it? In a hierarchical society, and most societies are hierarchical in one way or another, and there are differences of age and gender and role and so on, I think one has to see aspects of friendship in the relationship without saying that you can only have friendship if people are somehow absolutely equal. People never are absolutely equal. You can be friendly with your boss, you can be friendly with your employee. You're not absolutely equal, but there can be reciprocity about it in terms of the humor that you share, or the help that you give each other, or whatever it is, which isn't contractual, but is part of a flourishing human relationship that's positive and gives both people some sense of security and support. So I don't see equality as being necessary to every sort of friendship.
And going back to God, is there a reciprocity in friendship with God?
Well, I think that Sikhs would talk about sukh, which is a peace of mind, a contentment, which is a part of being attuned with the hukum, with the divine order of the universe, and being ready to be open to divine grace whilst being committed to service of others. So there is a reciprocity. It's a benefit in one's state of mind.
I'm sorry, I failed to see the reciprocity. God is our friend, and he gives us this sukh, but what does God as a friend get from us?
Well, the image that's very often used is of the lover and the beloved. So there is an assumption that the divine is benefiting, but I think also there is a danger of our somehow trying to see the divine very much in a Western monotheistic sort of mode, because Sikhs will be quite comfortable with statements like God is everywhere and God is everything. So although, yes, you can find something that seems close to a Christian or Jewish monotheism, there is also this a very much more, it's an Indic, if you like, awareness of the divine everywhere, which is just part of how everything is. And I don't think that Sikhs are going to sit puzzling over whether this pervasive divine is benefiting in some way from their devotion and their sense of that divine.
I just want to speak up for Judaism, which I don't usually as a context of an interview, where, I mean, because you've sort of pigeonholed Judaism into a very anthropomorphic, personalized form of religion, and quite distinct for the more, shall we say, pantheistic version of God being everywhere. And I think it may be true for other religions as well. I don't want to speak now about those, but certainly in the case of Judaism and the Kabbalistic and mystical tradition, it's not either or, it's both and. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the reflection on reciprocity can take place independently of the distinction between the more personal and the impersonal aspects of God, or the more personal and more cosmic aspects of God. So I just for the sake of rounding out the conversation theologically, I would say that the two do not necessarily, there's not a one-on-one relationship where if you hold to a more cosmic view of God's presence in creation, then questions of reciprocity or how God benefits don't come into. I mean, the Jewish experience is that we do both, and potentially others could do as well.
And I think that probably in all of what we call the world religions, there will be people making a similar point, because there is this whole range of human ways of interacting with the divine. And I think all of the religions take account of that, and it's part of their tradition.
And I want to take us back to God as the model friend. I think that's how you introduced or alluded at least to God's friendship. There's some model of the way God exemplifies friendship, and we move from that to reciprocity and ask the question about reciprocity. In what way are human friendships different then from the relationship with the divine, or the friendship with the divine, and can we model divine friendship in our relationships?
Well, I think they're different in that we actually know each other in a very different way from how we know God. We know that another human being has so many of the same experiences and attributes that we have ourselves, and the same sorts of limitations. And there's no way that that God fits into that, especially as Sikhs don't believe in God being incarnate. Okay, there are Sikhs who regard the Gurus and the Guru Granth Sahib, the scripture, as almost divine, or will even speak about the Gurus as their gods. But Sikh mainstream teaching is that God is Ajuni Sabham. God is self-existent and does not take birth on this earth. So that immediately means that God is very different from human beings, and the friendship is going to be different. But one of the things about God is grace. Sikhs are committed, if they are observant and religiously concerned, they're committed to the idea of leading a life of religious discipline, but they also know that there is a sense of God's unlimited graciousness, grace. There are words like prasad, which are translated as grace. And in terms of human friendship, I think one can learn from that, so that it's not a matter of exact equivalence of giving and taking on both sides, but of each person being ready to be more generous and abundant and forgiving in the way that Sikhs understand the divine power to be.
So, are there limitations on friendship? Should we be friendly to everything with everyone, or are there limitations on where friendships should lie?
Well, historically in the Sikh tradition, there have definitely been restrictions on friendships. As I mentioned, it wouldn't be appropriate in many Sikh contexts, especially in the past, for young men and young women, let's say, to be socializing together and in some sort of unchaperoned way. It simply wouldn't have been acceptable. But also, if you look at Sikh codes of discipline in the early centuries, it was made very clear that Sikhs should not be mixing with people who were of certain groups. They were groups who were honoring as guru religious leaders who were not recognized as guru by the mainstream. So if you like, they were heretics, and Sikhs were to remain away from them. And there are those who would also argue that some of the discipline that's attributed to the 10th Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, is actually partly about shoring up a social distinction between Sikhs and Muslims. So, okay, Muslims smoked, but Sikhs were not to use tobacco. They were not to. Muslims could have halal meat. Sikhs, if they ate meat, were to have jatka meat, the flesh of animals that had been killed in a different way. So it would seem as if part of early Sikh discipline was to maintain various distinctions. And the Sikh, I mean, perhaps this is another part of being a world religion. There are different ways of being Sikh and different groups amongst Sikhs. And there are some at the present time who regard eating together with people who are not following the same group discipline, in this case of only using iron vessels, containers, and no crockery, for example. Those who are not maintaining a very, very rigidly vegetarian regime and who are following the precepts of that particular group's understanding of being Sikh, then I've lost my sentence, but there should be separation, at least in terms of dining. People are more comfortable eating with those who are following the same rigidly disciplined path. So that limits friendship to an extent if you can't comfortably eat with people who are different. Now that's what I'm describing in the present, is a very minority group amongst Sikhs, but it's also an example actually of how the Langar cut across that sort of thing in its basic conception, as friendship does involve an eating together, feeling that you can socialize together. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Well, yes, you have, and I think there's possibly more, because I want to move. We've talked mostly about Sikh friendship within the Sikh religion, although when we were talking about the Langar, you talked about the outreach elements. And I want to speak about Sikh attitudes towards friendship with the religious other. Perhaps, as I say, you've already alluded to it, but what does Sikhism say about those friendships in general? Or is there an in general? Or is it all politically indicated, perhaps?
The basis, which I think just about every Sikh would refer to, is the inclusiveness, the fact that Sikhs Yes, they're friends with everybody. The Golden Temple, Harmandir Sahib, a holy place in Amritsar in Punjab, we're told over and over again by Sikhs that it has 4 entrances, which means that it's open of whatever caste, class, creed, to come in equally. Guru Nanak is the first Guru, who was born in 1469. He is depicted over and over again in pictures with his companion, his traveling companion, Mardana, who was a Muslim musician who played his stringed instrument while Guru Nanak sang the hymns, the truths that were being revealed to him through poetry. That is a very famous friendship, which is a model for Sikhs. Yes, there have been all sorts of unfortunate episodes in history, so that politically Sikhs and Muslims have been driven apart, with the partition of India in 1947, for example, or they've been driven apart from Hindus because of the troubles from the 1980s. But the vision is based on the tradition of Guru Nanak's way of regarding religious difference as irrelevant, and words that are attributed to Guru Nanak after his profound religious experience at the start of his ministry, where there's no Hindu, there's no Muslim. And that's understood in different ways. It can mean there's no true Hindu, there's no true Muslim. It can mean labels are irrelevant. It certainly seems to imply that religious difference is something which has no place in the Guru's and God's vision for the world. Sikhs, in a way, they don't see the point, I suppose, of formalized interfaith or interreligious dialogue, because they understand their tradition as being inclusive, and they will point over and over again to the fact that the Guru Granth Sahib, the scripture, includes not only the verses of the Gurus, but also of many Hindu and some Muslim saints. In fact, the oldest part of the Guru Granth Sahib is the poetry of Sheikh Farid, who was a Muslim mystic. So in that way, Sikhs take it for granted that they are already, in their tradition, deeply involved in respectful friendship with those of other traditions.
It seems to me, though, that the benefits of an interreligious friendship, when you're saying that religious difference doesn't really matter, and the benefits of an interreligious friendship, which is actually based on saying, yes, it matters, but maybe in a positive way, would be quite different. I wondered whether you'd reflect on the benefits of interreligious friendship for Sikhs. Is it that you say, well, we're just all human beings, or are there other benefits that can be gained from friendship?
Well, I'll try to move into the benefits, but I think I want to make 1 or 2 observations first. One is that traditionally, or in the past particularly, what has been much more difficult than interreligious friendship has been inter-caste friendship, because although many Sikhs buy into the idea that the Gurus somehow abolished the caste system, in fact, what the Gurus did was say that your birth status, your caste, was irrelevant to your spiritual progress. But society has remained, and still remains, fairly much structured on marriage happening within different caste groups. And so in the past, at least, and to some extent in the present, friendship across caste would be much more difficult, problematic, than, say, friendship with a Hindu of a similar caste background. Another thing to say is, because there is such fluidity between Sikh and Hindu, what counts as an intercaste or as an interreligious friendship? Some people would say, well, I'm really friends with Hindus, but others would say, but as we heard at the beginning of this, well, is there such a difference? Isn't it actually being friends within the same tradition? Sikhs will say, you know, Guru Tegh Bahadur gave his life. Well, that's the ultimate friendship for Hindus, so that they didn't have to convert to Islam. But then others could say, Hindus might say, but actually he himself was a Hindu, so was that interreligious? And then another thing I'd say, and this is not just true of Sikhs, this is true of just about every religious faith group I've come across, it's much easier to make friends with somebody who is a Buddhist or a Jew from a different community than it is to be comfortably friends with someone who's from a group that you regard as heretical, who claims to be Sikh or Christian, whatever, but you don't regard them as that. The benefits of interreligious friendship, of course, are very affirming, but I have to say that my experience of interfaith groups is that there's a certain sort of person who is really interested in interfaith friendship. And so a Sikh or a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian who has that interest, it's like people with a shared hobby. They're naturally going to enjoy asking each other questions, talking to each other, sharing food together. And I think it is really relevant to note that what brings people together is a sort of shared religious sensibility. So, for instance, if I talk about Gopinder, who has been my co-author, we have a certain sort of sensitivity or sensibility in common, and so that we understand each other in a way that we would find much more difficult if I was with somebody from a Christian or Quaker background even, who was temperamentally very different or who rubbished some of my ideas. And similarly, I'm sure that she could find some Sikhs who she was less on the, she wasn't on their wavelength in the way that she is with me. So I think we have to take account of that, and it's always exciting to discover a kindred spirit with a different religious label, and then start discovering insights, often insights that seem to be almost mutual, as well as those that are strikingly different. And that is a very enriching experience. And Sikhs, in my experience, are very ready to engage in discussion and to share time and be helpful and do all the things that friendship involves. So yes, interreligious friendship, it just brings an extra enhancing quality to friendships between kindred spirits. And using Sikh terminology, I think that the friendships work best when everybody is Gurmukh, when everyone is oriented towards the divine truth, rather than having different sorts of preoccupation.
Would you just
just saying, Peter, you had a knockout line there. A kindred spirit with a different religious label. It's been one of the best phrases I've ever heard. After the Coca-Cola advertising here in Israel, there's a whole theology there. In other words, we are initially spirit. The spirits have some kind of association on some undefined ground, but there is such a notion of a kindred spirit. And that domain of spirit, which is the source of friendship, is primary, and religious identity is secondary. It's like a label. And in friendship, we go beyond external labels to discover a more fundamental commonality that comes from the domain of spirit and transcends religions. That one phrase, it really says a mouthful.
And I think for me, it sums up the relationship I've had, for instance, with Kailash Puri, who shared her life story with me, and I co-authored it with her. And I think it's been true in interreligious friendships I can think of. Pyara Singh Sambi with Owen Cole, which bore fruit in the many publications that they produced together, and they regarded each other as brothers. Again, there was, kindred spirits.
But does true interfaith friendship necessarily require us to relegate all the particularity of religion to a second order?
Pass.
What?
I
said pass.
I didn't understand.
Pass. I'm not going to answer that question.
Oh, I see.
And, it's interesting because I was going to ask about the terminology, or whether you would have put the label a spiritual friendship and seen that as something different from a regular friendship. You seem to describe that with your co-author. Would you describe it?
Well, I think for me, regular friendships almost always have an aura of a shared humanity, which some people want to call spirituality.
I think, Peter, we never. There's two things we haven't explored. Yes. Unless I've missed it, I haven't heard the theoretical foundations why we should be friends with people of other religions. Just now, this discussion of kindred spirits, it does suggest that there's something fundamental. And we had earlier the notion of God's presence everywhere, which it could also provide. theological underpinnings, but I don't think we've actually looked at the potential theological underpinnings for why be friends with people of other religions. And then, are there limits to friendship, people we should not be friends with? I think those two interrelated questions I would love to hear Eleanor's input on.
I did speak a bit about the limits in terms of codes of practice in
Right,
previous
the food.
generations, at least, which restricted members of the Khalsa, those who were devoted to the Sikh Guru, restricted them from fraternizing with those who were following what were seen as spurious religious leaders. As far as the theological basis goes, the Guru Granth Sahib is poetry, and so is the writing of Guru Gobind Singh. Guru Gobind Singh famously talked about the human race as one. All of the gurus express that conviction that humanity is one. So that, to me, seems to underpin the idea and really be an imperative for friendship with those of other backgrounds and who have other ideas from one's own. But it can be quite a spirited sort of exchange. So you have Guru Nanak visiting the Siddhs, the Nats, the religious ascetics who are living in the mountains away from the rest of humanity. And he engages in a discussion in which he's not afraid to say that the world is the poorer because they have distanced themselves from it. So I think that models a sort of friendship and an engagement which is also critical, which doesn't leave the intellect behind, and which doesn't mean that we just fall in with whatever the other person says so as to be pleasing to them. And I think that's quite important as well.
So I can almost sum up your message. Humanity equals spirituality equals friendship.
No, I don't use mathematical signs in what I actually
You
mean.
what? You don't?
I don't use mathematical signs, mathematical symbols. I don't think we can reduce it to any sort of equation. I think that, especially when you have such a poetic tradition as the Sikh tradition, it's much more a tradition of images than it is of numerals, except for the Ik Omkar, that God is one, who is the one without hatred and fear.
So at this point, Eleanor, I would like to thank you very much indeed for your tremendous contribution to the summer school.
I hope some of it's useful.
I'm sure our students will benefit greatly from listening to this, and as you probably are aware, we'll do some text study to balance your wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you for the privilege of asking me when I'm not myself a Sikh, except in the wider sense of a Sikh as a learner.
Lovely, thank you.
Can I ask one question that has to do with the practicality? If it works out schedule-wise, would we be able to contact you right after we've seen this interview if the students have any further questions they want to pose to you and to engage you further?
Yeah, sure, but as long as you tell me when.
Yeah.
We'll look at the schedule. I want to at least create that option. That way they're not only passive and me having to represent you, because
oh yeah, that would be great.
Because otherwise you could say my mathematical mind and your poetic mind, I could do you injustice.
Just so you know, Eleanor, I didn't discuss it with you, but we moved last year from live interviews to pre-recorded, partly because of technology. We'd had too many failures, and this was a way of ensuring that we had the scholar there in the classroom in some way or other, but obviously it's not as good as if we can.
No, I'm quite happy for a follow-up, but just let me know when.
Yes, we'll be finessing the program when we've got all the interviews, see their lengths, and therefore know what time we're playing with. So thank you again. It was a privilege speaking to you.
Well, thank you.
It was a wonderful interview. Thank you very much for your wisdom, your experience, and I hope your husband forgives us for the slight delay in this.
I'll tell him that he needs to forgive someone in Israel.
You can tell him that it's just part of practicing universal friendship. He'll relate to it.
He can cope with that.
All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.